Oxtail soup filled kitchens with aromas grandmothers still talk about. Chitterlings carried rituals that older kids remember watching. Neckbone stew fogged windows while families gathered close. These meals kept black families alive through brutal 1970s winters when money ran out before the month did. Stewed rutabagas and carrots. These root vegetables sat in pantry corners long after everything else had spoiled. Cheap and often overlooked, they carried a sweetness that only deepened when cooked low and slow. Mothers peeled them, chopped them into thick chunks, and let them simmer in a pot with onions, salt, pepper, and a little fat if the house had any left. As they cooked, the rutabagas softened into something buttery while the carrots released their natural sugar into the broth. That earthy, comforting smell reminded everyone that winter food did not have to be complicated to satisfy. Kids sometimes wrinkled their noses at rutabagas, but by the time the pot was ready, they scooped out big spoonfuls without a second thought. Families held steady on this food, though it lacked the cultural weight of other meals. Plain and simple survival defined this pot. Homemade vegetable scrap broth. Back in the day, nothing left the kitchen if it could give even a little flavor. Carrot ends, onion skins, celery tops, bones, and whatever else the house had went into a pot of water to simmer for hours. Mothers coaxed every bit of goodness out of nothing, and this broth proved their skill. The scraps slowly released their flavor, turning the water into a warm, nourishing liquid that became the base for soups, rice, gravies, and stews throughout the week. Kids might not have understood the magic behind it, but they felt the warmth in every meal it helped create. This quiet survival strategy stretched across days during the coldest months. More foundation than meal, it still deserves its place among the foods that kept families alive. Fried cornmeal mush. Leftovers became something special after a night of freezing temperatures and thin blankets. Cornmeal mush started simple, just cornmeal cooked with water until it thickened into a heavy porridge. But the magic happened the next morning. Mothers sliced the chilled mush into thin rectangles, laid them in a hot skillet, and fried them until the edges crisped and the center stayed soft. That soft sizzle meant a warm breakfast was on the way. Kids loved the contrast in each bite, the crunch on the outside and the creamy middle inside. Sometimes syrup went over the top, sometimes powdered sugar, and sometimes nothing at all because the flavor was enough. This winter morning ritual turned scraps into sustenance. Sorghum syrup oatmeal. This bowl warmed you from the inside out before school or chores called you into the cold. It was a winter breakfast that stuck with you. Oats cost little and never failed, while sorghum syrup added a deep, earthy sweetness that made the meal feel more special than its price suggested. Mothers cooked the oats slowly until they thickened, then drizzled the syrup over the top so it melted into the warm bowl. Kids stirred it in eagerly, watching the syrup swirl through the oats until the whole thing turned golden. Each bite delivered sweetness, heartiness, and comfort. The kind of breakfast that kept your stomach full well into the afternoon. Quiet mornings in a warm kitchen while frost gathered on the windows tasted exactly like this. Every spoonful carried history. Salt pork and cabbage soup. Hard weather and harder weeks called for this meal, the kind that stretched calories when the fridge sat nearly empty. Salt pork added just enough fat and flavor to turn cabbage and water into something that tasted like a real dinner. Mothers chopped the cabbage, let it wilt in a pot with onions, then dropped in a small piece of salt pork that seasoned everything as it simmered. That savory, warm broth filled the kitchen with a smell that made kids feel like dinner would be enough after all. Cabbage softened into silky ribbons that soaked up every bit of flavor, and no one ever complained about the simplicity because it tasted good and filled the stomach. Poor families kept salt pork on hand because a little went a long way. Winter resilience filled every bowl. Okra and tomato winter stew. These were two ingredients black families knew how to stretch through lean months, and they came together in this humble pot. Canned tomatoes lasted forever and cost little, while frozen okra kept well enough to make it into most winter meals. Mothers combined them with onions, seasoning, and sometimes a leftover bone or bit of smoked meat if the house had some. The stew bubbled slowly, thickening as the okra softened and released its juices, turning the tomatoes into a sauce that coated every spoonful. Kids sometimes teased each other about texture of okra, but they still showed up with bowls in hand when the smell filled the house. Warm, savory, and surprisingly filling, this dish carried families through the days when fresh produce was impossible to afford. Okra itself carried African roots, brought to America during the transatlantic slave trade and cultivated by black hands ever since. Served with rice or cornbread, the stew became a complete meal that tasted far richer than its ingredients suggested. Stewed chicken gizzards. In this case, a single, affordable ingredient stretched impossibly far when times got hard. Gizzards cost barely anything, often sold in small tubs for pennies, but they became tender and flavorful when cooked long enough. Mothers browned them first, letting the edges sear, then covered them in water with onions and garlic. As the pot simmered for hours, the gizzards softened into something surprisingly rich, their broth turning thick and savory. Kids learned to love the chewy texture because it came wrapped in the kind of gravy that begged to be poured over rice or mashed potatoes. Warm, affordable, and filling, this meal delivered exactly what families depended on during winter weeks when money ran thin and the cold refused to let up. Cheap food could still taste like love. Sweet potato hash. There were long, cold evenings when the house felt drafty and the money was already gone for this meal. Sweet potatoes lasted for months if you stored them right, tucked into a cool corner where they held on even when everything else spoiled. Mothers peeled them, chopped them into thick cubes, and tossed them into a skillet with onions sizzling in a little oil. That deep, earthy scent settled low in the air and made kids drift into the kitchen to see if dinner was almost ready. As the potatoes softened and browned, the onions melted into them, giving every bite a sweetness mixed with a little sharpness that warmed you from the inside out. Kids loved scraping the crispy bits from the bottom of the pan, the ones that tasted smoky and rich like someone had cooked them just for them. Sweet potatoes had been a staple in Black American cooking since slavery. One of the few crops enslaved people were sometimes allowed to grow for themselves. This full skillet meal cost nearly nothing but felt like something made with intention and care. Crackling cornbread. With crackling cornbread, almost nothing turned into one of the most satisfying winter dishes. Leftover pork cracklings gave the cornbread a salty crunch that made it taste richer than it had any right to be. Mothers mixed the cornmeal, eggs, milk, and bits of crackling together, pouring the batter into a hot pan that sizzled the moment it touched the surface. That warm, sweet smell of baking cornbread filled the house even before it was ready. Kids loved the crispy edges most, the way the crackling gave each bite a little extra weight. The cracklings themselves came from rendering lard, scraps that would have been thrown away in wealthier kitchens but became treasure in households that wasted nothing. Thrift turned into pride, winter hunger held back by skill and heart. Peanut butter biscuits. Nights when meat was impossible to afford and the pantry looked emptier than anyone wanted to say out loud called for this winter comfort food. Peanut butter cost little, packed plenty of protein, and stretched a long way, so mothers mixed it into biscuit dough to make something heavier, richer, and more filling than a regular biscuit could ever be. The dough came together quickly, soft and slightly sticky, and once it hit the oven, the whole house filled with a smell that felt like a blanket wrapped around your shoulders. Kids waited for them to come out hot and golden, hoping to be the first to split one open and watch the steam rise. Sometimes syrup went on top, sometimes jelly, sometimes just a pat of butter if there was any left. No matter how they were served, the biscuits delivered warmth, thickness, and comfort in a way that made you forget for a moment how tight things were. Care Made Visible tasted exactly like this. Grits with redeye gravy. Grits cost little, cooked easy, and filled you up. The kind of food that could keep a child warm through a long school day when the walk to the bus stop felt like a challenge. The red-eye gravy, made from pan drippings and a splash of strong coffee, added a flavor that was sharp and comforting all at once. Mothers made it quickly, stirring the grits until they were smooth and spooning the gravy over the top with practiced hands. That smell alone could coax a sleepy child out of bed. Kids loved how the gravy soaked into the grits, giving each spoonful a deep, savory taste. Grits descended from the corn dishes that indigenous peoples shared with African Americans, and the addition of coffee to gravy was a Southern innovation born from making do with what you had. Families stayed fueled when winter stretched long and money stretched thin. Rice and gravy from pan drippings. When there was not enough food left in the house to make anything bigger, mothers turned to this reliable meal. Every drop of flavor mattered in those days, so nothing from a pan ever went to waste. Once the meat was gone, she would take the brown bits left behind, the tiny pieces of onion or seasoning clinging stubbornly to the bottom, and add water or milk to coax out every bit of richness. Slowly, the drippings dissolved, turning the liquid into a thin but deeply flavored gravy that smelled like a full dinner even when it was only a fraction of one. The rice went on the stove next, cheap, filling, and dependable, the kind of food that made sure no one went to bed hungry. Kids watched the steam rise from the pot, knowing that the gravy would soak into the grains and turn the simplest bowl into something warm and comforting. Winter cooking at its most honest, this meal took what you had and stretched it without apology. It held families steady through nights when the cold crept through the walls and the fridge felt painfully empty. Thrift turned into care, a mother's quiet determination to make something out of almost nothing: water, chitterlings, and potatoes. Time, patience, and a strong will went into this winter meal, but for many families, it was one of the few affordable ways to put something hearty on the table. Chitterlings cost little, and potatoes cost even less, so mothers used both to build a dish that filled the house with warmth during long cleaning days. The cleaning of the chitterlings was a ritual in itself, one that older kids knew well and younger kids watched with curiosity. Enslaved people received chitterlings, the cleaned intestines of pigs, as scraps, and black cooks transformed them into something worth eating. Once cleaned, the chitterlings simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and spices until they softened and soaked up every bit of flavor. Potatoes went in next, breaking down slowly and adding bulk to the dish. That strong, earthy, unmistakable aroma signaled both work and comfort. Kids may have hesitated at first, but by dinner time, they filled their plates gratefully. Dense, warming, and full of calories needed for the coldest days, this meal represented winter survival at its most traditional. Cabbage and smoked sausage skillet. Almost nothing turned into something that fed a whole house without anyone feeling shortchanged. Cabbage cost less than almost any other vegetable in the store, and it filled a pot in a way almost nothing else could. Mothers sliced it thin, tossed it into a skillet with a little oil, and stretched one single sausage link so far that every person at the table swore they got a piece. That unmistakable smell of cabbage hitting the pan was sharp at first, but softened as it cooked down into something sweet and cozy. The sausage added just enough smoke to trick the mind into thinking the meal was richer than it really was. Kids hovered, waiting for the moment when the cabbage wilted just enough to match the shine of the sausage pieces. German and Polish immigrants brought smoked sausage traditions to America, but black families in the South made these skillets their own, stretching small amounts of meat further than anyone thought possible. This dish kept people going when money ran tight. Catfish head stew. Frugality produced one of the most flavorful winter meals in many southern and urban black households. Fish heads cost almost nothing, sometimes given away by fishmongers, but they carried enough richness to season an entire pot. Mothers simmered them with onions, tomatoes, and seasoning, letting the fish release its oils and flavor into the broth. As the stew cooked, the aroma grew strong and comforting, a signal that dinner would fill stomachs even if the budget could not. Kids sometimes looked at the fish heads with curiosity or caution, but once the stew was served, they cleaned their bowls without complaint. The meat around the cheeks and collars was tender, and the broth tasted deeply of the water, even in landlocked neighborhoods where catfish came from local rivers or the back of a truck. In West Africa, using the whole fish was standard practice, and enslaved Africans brought this knowledge with them, ensuring nothing went to waste. Families who refused to let scarcity win made this a winter staple. Resourcefulness and resilience filled every pot. Chicken backs and rice. When the prices of better cuts climbed too high to touch, mothers relied on this practical winter meal. Chicken backs cost little, sometimes the only poultry a family could afford, but they carried enough meat and flavor to build an entire pot around. Mothers simmered them with onions and seasoning until the bones loosened and the broth turned golden. Then came the rice, poured in generously because rice made everything stretch. Kids watched the pot grow fuller and fuller as the grains absorbed the broth. The chicken pieces were small, but the flavor was big enough to make the whole meal feel complete. Butchers often sold backs for pennies because wealthier customers wanted breast meat and thighs, but black families knew the backs held just as much goodness if you cooked them right: warm, filling, and steady. This dish felt like a blessing when the weather outside refused to let up. Winter courage served in a bowl. Butter beans with smoked turkey tails. The entire house smelled like the best kind of winter comfort when this pot started simmering. Turkey tails cost little and sat overlooked at the butcher counter, but they released enough fat and smoke to transform butter beans into something rich and satisfying. Mothers simmered the beans slowly, letting the turkey tails soften and break apart as the pot cooked. The beans absorbed the flavor, turning creamy and thick. Kids knew the smell long before they heard the call for dinner, drifting toward the kitchen with bowls already in hand. Turkey tails became popular in black Southern cooking because they were affordable and flavorful, the kind of cut that wealthier families passed over but budget-conscious mothers knew how to use. The butter beans themselves were versatile and filling, a legume that had fed Southern families for generations. Served with rice or cornbread, it became a winter staple that no one forgot. Thrift turned into abundance. White beans with fatback. A small piece of fatback was enough to transform a plain pot of beans into something thick, smoky, and full of the kind of flavor that made you close your eyes for a second. Beans cost little and never failed, stretching across multiple days when they needed to, which was most winters in the 1970s. Mothers rinsed the beans, picked out the broken ones, and dropped them into a heavy pot, onions, and that precious slab of pork that melted down as the hours passed. Fatback was the layer of fat along a pig's back, cured with salt, and it was one of the cheapest cuts available, but its flavor made the whole meal feel bigger and deeper. The kitchen smelled warm and familiar, like hope simmering even when the world outside felt harsh. Kids knew beans meant full bellies, and they were thankful for that, even if they did not always say it. This food did not just feed you once, it lingered, warmed, and strengthened. Cornbread and pot liquor. Pot liquor was the broth left behind after cooking greens, and in many families it was considered just as valuable as the greens themselves. Thick, salty, and full of nutrients, it became a meal all on its own when paired with a slice of cornbread. The vitamins and minerals from the greens leached into the cooking liquid, making pot liquor one of the most nutritious things a poor family could consume. Mothers crumbled the cornbread into the pot liquor or poured the broth directly over the bowl, letting it soak until the edges softened. Kids loved it more than they ever admitted, especially on nights when the cold felt sharp and the house needed something warming. During slavery and the decades of poverty that followed, pot liquor represented the genius of making something from what others discarded. Simple food that tasted like something older, something that came from the days when nothing could be wasted. Winter resilience filled every bowl. Black-eyed pea soup. This dish filled the house for days, getting thicker and richer each time it was reheated. Peas cost little, lasted long, and never failed, making them perfect for winters when groceries had to stretch far beyond their limits. Mothers simmered them with onions, leftover bones, and simple seasoning, letting the pot bubble low and slow. That earthy, familiar smell drifted through the rooms and made the whole house feel warmer. Black-eyed peas carried enormous cultural significance. Eaten on New Year's Day for luck and prosperity, a tradition that stretched back to West Africa and continued through slavery and beyond. Kids did not always know what went into it, but they knew it kept them full when the wind outside made the walls creak. Served with cornbread or rice, it carried families through weeks when money was gone, but determination remained. Survival food, hope food, winter food. This pot never stopped giving. Pinto beans and ham hock. This pot simmered slow and steady while the cold pressed against the windows. Pinto beans cost little and came in big bags that could last for several meals, and a single ham hock turned them into something hearty and deeply flavored. Ham hocks were the joint of a pig's leg, full of collagen and connective tissue that broke down during cooking and gave the beans their thick, silky texture. Mothers soaked the beans overnight when they could, then dropped them into a large pot with onions, water, and the ham hock sitting right in the center like a small anchor holding everything together. As it simmered for hours, the ham hock released its salt and smoke, and the beans drank it in until the whole pot thickened into something that felt like warmth itself. Kids wandered in and out of the kitchen, asking if it was ready yet, even though they knew it never was until dinner time. A winter promise that no one would go to bed hungry. Collard greens with hog jowl. Black families turned to this dish when the cold settled deep and the fridge looked emptier than anyone wanted to admit. Hog jowl cost far less than most other cuts, but it added a smoky richness that turned greens into something powerful. The pot simmered for hours, filling the house with a slow, rising warmth that made you forget how cold it was outside. Collard greens themselves stood as a symbol of Black American resilience, a vegetable that enslaved people cultivated and perfected, turning tough leaves into something tender and deeply flavored. Kids grew up on this smell, associating it with safety, hunger, and comfort all at once. The greens softened as they cooked, soaking up every bit of flavor the hog jowl released. Hog jowl, the cured meat from a pig's cheek, was traditionally eaten on New Year's Day alongside black-eyed peas, but it made appearances throughout the winter whenever a family needed something rich and cheap. Tradition, resourcefulness, and the kind of food made by people who knew how to survive anything. Not just nourishment, but a lesson passed down one pot at a time. Oxtail soup. Back when oxtails were still affordable, this was one of the richest winter meals a family could make without spending much at all. Before the cut became expensive and trendy, butchers practically gave it away, and mothers knew exactly how to turn it into a pot of gold. She browned the oxtails first, letting the fat render and the bones darken in the pot. Then came water, onions, seasoning, and whatever vegetables the house could spare. The pot simmered for hours, filling the kitchen with a smell so deep and savory, it seemed impossible that the meal had cost so little. As the soup cooked, the gelatin from the bones melted into the broth, giving it a thickness that warmed the body and soothed the spirit. Oxtails were exactly what the name suggested, the tail of cattle, full of bones, cartilage, and small pockets of meat that became impossibly tender with long cooking. Kids waited for the moment when the meat fell off the bone with barely any effort, soft and tender from the long, slow heat. Rich, nourishing, and comforting, this food helped families push through the coldest months with something warm in their bellies. Winter elegance built from scraps. Winter greens and beans over rice. This was a complete meal built from the most dependable ingredients in a Black household pantry. Collards or turnip greens lasted through the cold, and dried beans stretched across days with hardly any cost. Mothers simmered the greens until they were tender, adding beans and seasoning to make the pot richer and more filling. This dish represented the perfect marriage of African, Caribbean, and Southern American cooking traditions, a bowl that told the story of migration, adaptation, and survival. Poured over rice, a handful of simple ingredients transformed into something hearty enough to keep everyone full through the long winter evening. Enslaved Africans cultivated rice in the Carolina Low Country, and its presence in this dish was no accident but a continuation of ancestral knowledge. Kids ate it eagerly because it tasted good, but also because it felt steady and familiar. When there was nothing else, this meal appeared, and it always delivered. Survival disguised as comfort. Neckbone stew. When the cold crept in and the money ran out faster than anyone wanted to admit, neck bones cost only a few cents, but they carried enough flavor to build a whole pot of warmth around them. If you knew what you were doing, mothers and grandmothers rinsed them clean, dropped them into a big pot of water, and let them simmer for hours until the kitchen filled with a slow, steady steam that made the windows fog up. Neck bones were vertebrae from pigs, full of small muscles, fat, and connective tissue that transformed during cooking into something almost magical. Onions, celery, salt, pepper, and maybe a bay leaf if the house had one left. All of it went in to stretch the bones into something that tasted rich and full. Even though the ingredients were simple, kids hovered near the stove, claiming they were cold, but really just waiting for that moment when the meat softened enough to fall from the bone with no effort. Rice or potatoes always went on the side because that was how you made a meal last, and nobody ever complained because the stew soaked into everything it touched. This was the meal that defined 1970s winter survival cooking, the dish that grandmothers talk about with reverence and grandchildren remember with longing. Not fancy and never pretending to be, it kept bellies warm during winters that felt too long and too hard. Survival, patience, and the kind of care that did not need big speeches. A winter meal that carried whole families through nights when the house felt drafty and the bills piled high. Even today, people remember it with a quiet kind of gratitude, the ultimate survival meal of its era. Cornbread, not that boxed mix that tastes like sugar cake, but real cast iron cornbread, the kind where your mama poured bacon grease in the pan first, let it heat until it hissed, then poured the batter in so it crisped up golden around the edges. You could smell it all the way from the porch. That smell meant dinner was ready, the day was winding down, and everything in the world was right again. Back then, cornbread wasn't a side, it was the heart of the table. Today, it's rare to see a young one pull out buttermilk or stone ground cornmeal. Everything's boxed, quick, digital, but you can't microwave that sound, that crust snapping when it's cut. Do you still remember that sound? And then there was smothered chicken, not fried, not baked, smothered. That meant you seasoned it heavy, salt, pepper, garlic, maybe a little paprika, then browned it slow until the skin talked back at the skillet. Then came the gravy, made from scratch, pulled from the same pan drippings. Mama didn't measure, she felt it. Flour, broth, onions, and thyme. It would bubble low and thick until the whole house smelled like comfort. Back then, that dish meant stay a while. You'd sit down with rice or mashed potatoes, soaking up every drop. These days, we scroll while eating, rushing through meals that used to take half a day. But do you remember when dinner was the event, not the interruption? Next came collard greens with smoked turkey or neck bones. The smell alone told a story. That pot would simmer all day, and you knew not to lift the lid too much or mama would fuss. She'd throw in vinegar, red pepper flakes, maybe a pinch of sugar if the greens were too bitter. And when it was done, that broth at the bottom, the pot liquor, that was gold. That was history, vitamins, flavor, and pride all in one. Mama would say, "Don't you dare throw that out. You'd soak it up with cornbread, close your eyes, and feel the ancestors nod. Now, too many folks reach for kale chips and forget that greens used to be our slow anthem, proof that good things take time. Do you remember the patience of waiting for that pot to finish? Then there was sweet potato pie, not pumpkin, sweet potato. You could always tell who knew what they were doing by the way they mashed the potatoes smooth. Butter, sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, vanilla, and just a whisper of lemon to brighten it up. The crust wasn't store-bought, it was rolled on a floured counter with love and maybe a few words of prayer. When that pie came out the oven, the smell wrapped the whole house in Thanksgiving and childhood all at once. And when it cooled, Mama would slice it slow, making sure the first piece didn't fall apart. You'd get that taste, creamy, spiced, soulful. Now you see store-bought pies stacked in plastic, no story behind them, no fingerprints of love. Can you still remember what that first bite felt like? Warm and sweet, like being safe again. And then, black-eyed peas, the New Year's tradition, cooked low and slow with smoked meat, onions, and that one bay leaf Mama said brought luck. She didn't play about that bay leaf. Those peas weren't just food, they were a ritual. Eat them for prosperity, she'd say. You didn't know what that meant back then, but you did it anyway. You learned faith through flavor, belief through habit. Nowadays, folks forget. They skip the pot, skip the prayer. But when that spoon hit your mouth back then, you tasted hope. Do you still cook hope? Fried catfish. That was Saturday night food. Cornmeal dusted, hot grease popping, fish sizzling in the cast iron. Mama had a rhythm. Drop, wait, flip, drain. It came out golden and crisp, never greasy. Served with white bread, hot sauce, maybe coleslaw on the side. The smell would drift out the screen door, calling the neighborhood like a song. That sound of the grease crackling was music. You didn't need fancy meals. You just needed that plate. Now fish gets baked, air fried, or forgotten. But when's the last time you ate something that reminded you of who you are? Then there was okra stew. Slimy if you didn't know what you were doing, but Mama did. She'd mix it with tomatoes, onions, maybe shrimp or sausage, and cook it until it melted into something thick, earthy, and comforting. That dish taught patience, taught technique. You couldn't rush okra. You had to learn balance, heat, time. The smell was herbal, tangy, and deep, like the South itself. These days, okra's almost gone from kitchens. Too messy for modern life. But do you remember when cooking was messy and beautiful? Rice pudding came next, the sweet cousin of struggle food. Leftover rice turned into dessert with milk, eggs, sugar, raisins, and nutmeg. Nothing wasted, everything cherished. The oven would hum, the top would brown, and that smell. It felt like bedtime stories and hand-me-down quilts. You learned love in those leftovers. Now leftovers get tossed without a thought. Have we forgotten how to make something special from what's left behind? And oh, gumbo. That wasn't a recipe, it was a ceremony. Roux made dark as coffee, stirred slow so it didn't burn. That was a test of patience. Okra, shrimp, sausage, crab, onions, celery, bell pepper, the holy trinity of flavor. Every house had its version, its secret. It wasn't just about what was in the pot, it was about who was in the house. Neighbors dropping by, laughter spilling over, stories being told between bites. That pot didn't just feed stomachs, it fed bonds. You can't DoorDash that. Do you still remember what togetherness tastes like? Finally, candied yams, sweet, sticky, glossy with caramelized butter and brown sugar, spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, sometimes topped with marshmallows if Mama felt fancy. It wasn't just dessert, it was abundance on a plate. You'd eat them slow, savoring that syrup that dripped into your dressing and made everything taste better. These days, folks cut sugar, cut corners, cut time. But back then, sweetness was a language. Do you still speak it? You see, these recipes weren't just meals, they were love letters written in grease stains and wooden spoons. Each one carried history, from the fields to the freedom table, and every black child who ever stood on a kitchen stool to stir the pot was learning more than cooking. They were learning survival. They were learning care. Now, so many of those flavors are fading, traded for convenience, speed, and silence. But food, especially our food, was never just about hunger. It was about healing. You can almost hear your mama's voice again, can't you? Taste it. Tell me what it needs. Tell me, what's the first dish that takes you home? You remember macaroni and cheese, not the boxed kind with powdered orange dust, but the baked one that was a masterpiece every Sunday. Mama would start by boiling elbow macaroni, careful not to overcook it. Then she'd build that sauce from scratch. Real butter, evaporated milk, a mix of sharp cheddar, Colby, and a touch of Velveeta to make it stretch. She didn't need a recipe, she had instinct. That bubbling golden top that came out the oven, that was more than food. That was ceremony. You'd wait for it to cool just enough so the cheese stretched when you lifted your fork. Back then, every family reunion had a mac and cheese queen, and if hers didn't hit right, the whispers started before dessert. These days, folks grab pre-made trays or toss it in an air fryer. But tell me, do you still remember the joy of scraping the crispy corners for that last piece of perfection. Then there was fried cabbage. You'd hear that sizzle before you smelled it, butter melting down, onions frying soft, cabbage ribbons going in, then that dash of vinegar to make it sing, maybe some bacon bits for flavor. The pan steamed and crackled, filling the kitchen with a sweet, tangy perfume that clung to your clothes. Mama always said, cabbage will keep you humble and fed. It wasn't fancy, but it was full of flavor, of memory, of meaning. These days, cabbage barely makes it to the table, replaced by kale salads that don't know the sound of a skillet. But do you remember when the cheapest things tasted the richest? In red beans and rice. That was Monday's meal, every week without fail. A pot of beans cooked down until creamy, seasoned with smoked sausage or ham hock, garlic, and a bay leaf. The rice, perfectly steamed, wasn't a side. It was part of the soul of the dish. Mama would start that pot early, let it simmer all day while she ironed, cleaned, and hummed under her breath. By dinner time, the whole house smelled like warmth itself. It was poor folks' food made royal. Now, fast foods replaced it and slow foods forgotten. But when you smell that mix of beans, smoke, and thyme, doesn't your heart still remember to slow down? Then came hot water cornbread. Simple but sacred. Cornmeal, salt, hot water. That's it. Mixed into patties and fried golden brown in oil until crisp on the outside, soft inside. It was the bridge between nothing and something. If there wasn't much else, there was always that. Mama would fry them while humming, her hands steady, her patience unshakable. You'd grab one hot off the plate and burn your tongue because you couldn't wait. That flavor, a little salt, a lot of love. Nowadays, people call it old-fashioned, but old-fashioned was what kept us full. When's the last time you tasted simplicity done perfectly? Then there was oxtail stew. That one took all day. You'd brown those oxtails in oil until the house smelled like Sunday, then add broth, onions, garlic, and thyme, letting it all simmer until the meat fell right off the bone. The gravy turned rich, almost silky, with flavors that seemed deeper than the pot itself. Served over rice or mashed potatoes, it felt like luxury built out of scraps. Mama used to say, we learned to make the hard cuts taste like heaven. Now, oxtails are high-end, sold in fancy restaurants, but the secret always belonged to her. Do you remember when struggle food was transformed by skill, not money? Chitterlings, or chitlins, if you really knew. That smell hit first. Strong, stubborn, unforgettable. You could smell it down the block. Cleaning them was an all-day job. Boiling, rinsing, cleaning again. But when Mama was done and they simmered with onions, vinegar, and pepper, something magical happened. It wasn't about the taste, it was about pride. It said, we made something out of nothing. You didn't always love them, but you respected them. Today, most folks turn their noses up, but that smell, that unmistakable, unapologetic scent of heritage, that's a whole history lesson. Do you remember how love sometimes didn't smell sweet but stayed strong anyway? Next, buttermilk biscuits, the real ones, soft, flaky, layered with years of practice. Mama never used a cutter, just her hands. Flour dust in the air, dough folded and pressed with love. When they came out of the oven, hot and golden, she'd brush the tops with butter until they glistened. You'd pull one apart, steam rising, and watch that butter melt right through. Served with syrup, molasses, or sausage gravy, it didn't matter. It felt like morning. Now biscuits come in cans that pop open, but can you still recall the sound of real dough being patted by hand? Chicken and dumplings, that was the definition of comfort. Chicken simmered until tender, broth turned thick and creamy, dumplings dropped in like clouds. You'd hear the gentle bubbling, smell the mix of thyme, onion, and love. That dish hugged you from the inside. On cold nights, it wasn't just food, it was warmth, faith, and peace in a bowl. Today, we sip instant soups, forgetting that soup used to take hours, not seconds. Can you still remember what patience tastes like? Then there was banana pudding, not the instant one, but the real deal. Homemade custard layered with vanilla wafers and sliced bananas, topped with meringue brown just right. Mama would chill it and tell you not to touch it yet, though you'd sneak a spoonful anyway. The first bite was soft, sweet, and soothing, like forgiveness. The smell of bananas and vanilla still makes your chest ache with memory. Now it's just pudding cups and whipped cream. But tell me, do you still crave the one that had your fingerprints in the bowl? And beef neckbone stew, poor man's meal turned masterpiece, simmered slow with onions, carrots, potatoes, and a dark broth that could make you close your eyes in gratitude. Those bones gave flavor nothing else could. Mama said it was meat with meaning. You'd eat it with rice or cornbread, making sure not to waste a drop. These days, neck bones are forgotten, but back then, they were a symbol of thrift, of art, of endurance. Can you still hear the spoon scraping the last bit of gravy off the plate? Then came sweet tea, cold, dark, and strong enough to hold a spoon. Mama would brew it on the stove, pour it over sugar while it was hot, so it dissolved just right, then chill it until beads of sweat formed on the glass. You drink it on the porch, the world slowing down with each sip. It wasn't just tea, It was time, a pause, a permission to rest. Now tea comes bottled, sterile, soulless. But can you still remember how it felt when thyme tasted sweet? You see, every one of these recipes was more than nourishment. They were lessons in patience, gratitude, and faith. Each dish told you how to survive with dignity, how to feed a family on spirit when the wallet was thin. They were the flavors of resilience. Mama never said, "I love you," much. She showed it through pots that simmered, bread that rose, pies that cooled on windowsills. That was her language, food as affection. So when we forget these recipes, we're not just losing ingredients, we're losing stories, memories, and the quiet ways love used to speak. You can still hear the echo of it if you listen close, the scrape of a spoon, the hum of a woman cooking without hurry. You remember bread pudding, that miracle of a dessert made from what most folks would throw away. Stale bread, milk, eggs, sugar, cinnamon, and raisin, baked until golden and soft. When Mama made it, the whole kitchen smelled like mercy, sweet, warm, forgiving. Nothing was ever wasted. Everything had a second chance. She'd drizzle it with homemade vanilla sauce, thick and glossy, and it felt like a hymn when you tasted it. You learned more than cooking from that dish. You learned redemption. These days, people toss out bread without a thought, forgetting how something old could still be made new. Tell me, do you still remember how good second chances taste? Then came pork chops and gravy. The sound of that skillet popping was the sound of joy. Mama would dredge each chop in flour, salt, and pepper, then fry them until crisp and brown. The drippings left in the pan were sacred. That's where the gravy was born. She'd whisk in flour, milk, and patience until it turned smooth, rich, and soulful. Served with rice or mashed potatoes, it was a masterpiece built from everyday things. Now people bake them dry, rush them fast, miss the soul in the sizzle. But do you remember when that first bite felt like home sitting heavy on your tongue? Lima beans and ham hocks, slow cooked until the beans were tender, creamy, and infused with the deep smoky taste of the meat. Mama would season it with onions, a little garlic, and a sprinkle of pepper flakes. It wasn't flashy, just honest. You'd spoon it up, feel it fill you slow, steady, sure. That pot sat on the back burner half the day, humming like a steady song. These days, slow cooking's gone out of fashion, replaced by pressure cookers and fast fixes. But patience made flavor. Do you remember when waiting was part of the recipe? Then candied apple, sticky, glossy red, cooling on wax paper. Mama would dip each apple in that boiling sugar syrup, her hands steady, her eyes sharp. The smell, sweet and sharp, caramelized sugar and childhood in the air. You couldn't wait to bite it, even though you knew it'd stick to your teeth. Fairs, school festivals, autumn afternoons, they all smelled like that. Today, we buy snacks wrapped in plastic, all identical, all hollow. But can you still taste the sweetness that left your lips stained red? Mama made it with what was fresh, what was available. It was her way of saying, we make do. Now we chase imported things and forget the magic in what's near us. Do you remember when local wasn't a label, just life? Every dish was a story. Every story a thread in something larger, community. Mama didn't just feed a household, she fed a whole history. Food wasn't about recipes, it was about remembering who we were when we had nothing but each other. And when you sat down at that table, whether it was a feast or a humble meal, you always said grace, because gratitude wasn't just for the good times, it was for the simple ones. That's what these recipes were, gratitude made edible. And now, as so many of these flavors fade, we have to ask ourselves, what are we passing down in their place? Are we giving our children the taste of tradition or just convenience? The kitchen used to be the heartbeat of the home, where laughter, discipline, and faith all happened over a hot stove. Now it's quiet, stainless steel, lifeless. But maybe it's not too late. Maybe one day you'll roll up your sleeves, turn on the radio, and make one of those dishes again, by memory, not measurement. Tell me, when was the last time a smell made you cry? These days, breakfast is protein bars and screens. But do you remember when history sat on your plate and you ate it proudly? That's what all of this was about, pride. Black mothers didn't just teach recipes, they taught resilience disguised as dinner. They turned scarcity into abundance, bitterness into beauty, leftovers into love. They measured nothing, yet every dish was perfect, because perfection wasn't the goal, nourishment was. Every stir, every simmer, every burnt fingertip was a language. You didn't need to ask if she loved you. You could taste it. You could smell it before you even reached the kitchen door. And now, as those recipes fade, what remains isn't just the loss of food, it's the loss of memory. The kind of memory that tied families together across generations, that said, we made it before and we'll make it again. But you can still bring it back. You can still find that old cast iron skillet, still fry something slow, still hum a tune your mama used to sing under her breath. You can still fill your kitchen with the same smell that once filled hers. Maybe you'll burn the first batch. Maybe you'll forget the spice. But maybe, just maybe, someone younger will walk by, smell it, and stop, because something deep in their bones will recognize recognize it. That's how tradition survives. Not by perfection, but by repetition, by remembering, by cooking, by loving. So maybe it's time to pick one recipe, just one, and bring it back. Make it the way she did. Taste it, close your eyes, and listen for her voice. Because the truth is, those recipes aren't lost. They're waiting in the flour canister, in the bottom of your memory, in that one skillet you never threw away. And when you cook them again, she's there, standing right beside you, wiping her hands on that same old apron, saying softly, "Now that's how it's done, baby." When you think back, you realize it was never just about the food. It was about rhythm. The way your mother moved around that kitchen like she'd rehearsed it her whole life. The shuffle of slippers on linoleum, the hiss of oil, the hum of an old gospel record in the background. You didn't need a recipe card to understand that she was creating something bigger than dinner. She was preserving a language. Every stir, every taste, every sprinkle of salt was her way of saying, "I love you, I've got you, and you're going to be all right." Back then, food wasn't fast. It was patient. A pot of greens could simmer all day. A pound cake took the better part of an afternoon. It was an unspoken rule that flavor took time, that love did too. Today, everything is instant. Instant meals, instant messages, instant everything. But those dishes your mother made, they reminded you that some things can't be rushed. She taught you that seasoning doesn't come from a packet, but from the soul. That it's not about the brand of butter, but the care that melts it into the pan. And maybe that's what's been lost most of all. The patience to sit still long enough for something to mean something. Because her recipes weren't written down. They were lived. She didn't measure. She remembered. Just a pinch, she'd say. A little more till it feels right. You'd stand there, watching, thinking you'd never forget how she did it. But then, life got loud. The world sped up. And somewhere between the drive-through line and the late nights, you realized how much you missed that slow magic. The truth is, Black mothers didn't just feed their children. They fortified them. Those meals were protection, culture, prayer, and poetry all rolled into one. A pot of beans wasn't just dinner. It was a reminder of survival. Fried chicken wasn't just a recipe. It was a ritual. Sweet potato pie wasn't just dessert. It was identity. Every flavor carried history. Whispers from grandmothers who worked fields and kitchens and still made time to feed their families with pride. You didn't just eat her food, you inherited it. Now the challenge is keeping it alive, not as nostalgia, but as practice. When you cook those recipes again, when you stir the pot the way she did, taste it, close your eyes, and say, almost, you bring her back. You carry her through time, through distance, through generations. You remind yourself and whoever's sitting at your table that love, real love, is often simmering on the stove long before you taste it. So maybe tonight, instead of ordering takeout, you roll up your sleeves. You pull out that old cast iron skillet, maybe a little worn but still sturdy. You make her biscuit. You fry that chicken. You season those greens the way you remember, or maybe the way you feel. You let the house fill up with the smell of what used to be, because that smell, that's memory cooking itself into the walls again. And when you sit down to eat, don't rush. Take a bite. Close your eyes. Let it hit you. That deep, quiet knowing that you've just done something sacred. You've brought her back for a moment. You've kept the story alive. So here's the truth. Recipes fade, memories blur, but taste remembers. And if you ever find yourself missing her, all you have to do is cook, because every time you do, she's right there, humming softly, wiping her hands on that old towel, and smiling like she never left. If you still remember even one of her recipes, write it down, pass it on, let it live again, because love, real love, always finds its way back to the table. Those flavors weren't just food, they were history, love, and lessons disguised as dinner. If this stirred up a memory, don't let it fade. Be sure to click on the card showing on the screen as you pass it on, and keep her kitchen alive, because every recipe you remember keeps her voice alive too.